again, the legal process is a challenge. But at the same time, the courts do have the power issuing temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctions to stop some of the activity that's going on right now because of the use of executive orders to essentially impound what the Congress has actually appropriated. It is a long process, but I do think justice is going to eventually prevail. It just takes time.
That's today's guest on Sidebar, Lewis Clark, Executive Director and CEO of the Government Accountability Project.
Sidebar is brought to you by Monterey College of Law, San Luis Obispo College of Law, Kern County College of Law, Empire College of Law located in Santa Rosa, and the Colleges of Law with campuses in Santa Barbara and Ventura.
Welcome to Sidebar, featuring conversations about optimism in action with lawyers and leaders inspiring change. And now your co-hosts, Jackie Gardina and Mitch Winnick.
Jackie, as always, I'm very excited about our guest today. Our guest is Lewis Clark, Executive Director and CEO of the Government Accountability Project. But that title doesn't even begin to explain all of the types of issues that Lewis and the Government Accountability Project handle. Lewis has over 4 decades of work in what I would consider the most essential public service, which is dealing with issues such as social reform initiatives, free speech, the list goes on and on, whistleblower protection. I really look forward to talking to Lewis to see how they're handling all of those challenges in the current era.
I'm excited to talk about this too. I have 1,000 questions. So, Lewis, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll get started.
It's my pleasure.
Lewis, what we like to do is talk a little about the human story, about how you got involved in this righteous work. Looks to me like you started as a Methodist minister, then transitioned into law, and now into these areas of public policy. Tell us a little about your story.
When I graduated from seminary, it was clear to me that I was not destined to have a church, but at the same time, I was hoping to find a career that would help me get to the point where I'd be providing services that were necessary and helpful to people, but at the same time, not having necessarily a congregation. So I actually left the country and was traveling for 3 years after seminary and decided to come back and go to law school at that point. And my church actually recognized my work at the Government Accountability Project for about 15 years as a form of ministry. It's just at some point you have to have a church in our Methodist church. At that point, I went to a different status with my church, but at the same time continued on at the Government Accountability Project. And what we do at GAP is to help people make decisions, ethical, moral decisions in the workplace, and then act on those. And of course, we then defend what might happen to them when they do so.
So interesting, Lewis, that your church recognized the work that you do as a form of ministry for 15 years, and then the way you describe it as really helping people make moral decisions, ethical decisions about how to proceed in a fraught situation. I really love that framing.
Lewis, the Government Accountability Project has a broad mandate of so many things you're working on. Could you kind of encapsulate the major priorities of the Government Accountability Project?
Yeah, the major priority is to help people within the workplace make ethical and moral decisions about their work, and then provide that support, both in terms of disclosing or dealing with the concern that they raise, as well as defending them if they get in trouble having raised those concerns. So it really is focused on the workplace, and it's really very much focused on the employee who is in a situation where they need help doing the right thing.
Jackie and I were talking briefly before we started about how there seems to be, at least to us, a greater fear among employees about whether they can actually be protected if they were to step up as whistleblowers. Is that just our impression, or is that something your organization is sensing as well?
Yes, and it's somewhat new. Never before have people been so fearful for their own safety. We've never seen this before. I think this sort of new phase of fear began with President Trump's first administration. It was with the Ukraine whistleblower. It was really right after the Ukraine whistleblower where members of his family or his entourage or his fellow travelers or whatever started actually putting the names of people, naming people in broadcasts that went out to tens of millions of people. One of our clients was identified as having blown the whistle on Ukraine. And it just happened that that whistleblower did not do that. So it was a mistaken identity. But this person then had to leave his family for the safety of the family.
We have whistleblower statutes in part because there is a fear of retaliation, but that retaliation has in the past taken the form of potentially losing their job or having those kinds of pieces brought against them in the workplace or excluding them from the workplace. But now what people are more worried about is the physical safety of them and their families.
I think it's probably more accurate to say that some people have that fear. I would say that most whistleblowers still don't fear for their safety, but a larger number than ever before do, in our experience. The more average whistleblower situation, it still is the job. Actually, there's two major fears that employees have who have seen wrongdoing of one form or another and are contemplating what to do. There's the fear of retaliation, which is real and always present. And secondly, there's the fear of futility, which is that if they do something, nothing will happen. So they take this great risk and it won't change anything, which is why our organization, unlike your sort of typical law firm will defend people in terms of the retaliation. But what we do as an organization is go a huge step further, which is to see that their concerns are raised and addressed at whatever level necessary in order to obtain some kind of reform in relationship to the concerns that these whistleblowers have raised.
Yeah, and so let me just check in about that because I think one of the things that we have relied on, we're talking right now about a whistleblower perhaps in the government, like Colonel Vindman, when he made his disclosure about the call involving the Ukrainian president during President Trump's first administration that led to an impeachment. There's a whistleblower statute. It requires enforcement. And so we've thought of the DOJ, the Department of Justice, as an independent agency that would take seriously the enforcement of whistleblower protections. Is that something that can be relied upon in the same way?
You cannot rely on the Department of Justice as being the vehicle for protecting whistleblowers. I mean, there is an Inspector General office at the Department of Justice, which it can be very helpful. But the Department of Justice really is going to defend the government. And so if the whistleblower is adverse to the government, or is at least the government interprets it as adverse, then the Department of Justice is not going to be helpful. But there are many other agencies that, have been very helpful at times and other times not. And that is the Office of Special Counsel, which is a whistleblower office within the federal government where whistleblowers can go, can raise their concerns, and can get some levels of protection. There is the Merit Systems Protection Board, which is the adjudicative body of the civil service system, which will allow a whistleblower to come and contest the retaliation that has happened to them. And those are supposed to be, or were set up by Congress, to be independent of the executive branch. And unfortunately, there has been a recent decision, it's sort of an emergency decision by the Supreme Court that indicates that the president can actually fire the chairman of the Merit Systems Protection Board, and also indications at the Court of Appeals level that the special counsel can also be fired potentially by the president. And so that means that those agencies that used to be independent are now leaning much more toward carrying out the political wishes of this administration. Those are the two main guardrails for whistleblowers that are now being compromised.
Like so many of the guests on this show, I went to law school because I wanted the tools to create change. If you have that same passion and you want to develop the necessary skills and knowledge in a nurturing environment built for working adults, join us at Colleges of Law with both in-person and online learning options. Take the first step to building a better future for you and your community at collegesoflaw.edu.
Louis, help us understand the type of topics that would be appropriate and categorized as legitimate whistleblowing. We're not really talking about a disgruntled employee, I presume, that's not getting their breaks on time, or they were passed over for a promotion. There must be some specific guidelines of what would qualify. What would be in those categories?
Very clear guidelines from the Congress signed by the president. So it's illegality, gross waste of funds, gross mismanagement, abuse of authority, specific health and safety dangers, as well as refusal to obey an illegal order, as well as messing with scientific findings. So those are all categories that are recognized and in terms of the public interest as well as the law, are recognized as legitimate whistleblowing. What's not included there, and sometimes can be very confusing, is your disagreement on policy. Even if the policy ends up being a disaster or whatever, it's like policy is not what you can raise as an employee. But if the manifestation of that policy ends up creating gross waste, gross mismanagement, abuse of authority, and these other things, then of course you can blow the whistle. But the policy itself, no.
How do you guys handle an inquiry? My guess is the number of inquiries may be increasing. The list you just provided gives rise, in my mind, to a number of things we read about in the news that might trigger concerns. So someone contacts you. What is the process the Government Accountability Project goes through to vet an issue?
We have a rather intensive process of not only checking out the best that we can, the credibility of the person, however we're able to do that, testing the credibility of the person coming forward, as well as substantiating the concern that this whistleblower has raised. Our feeling about it, and I think our experience too, is that we feel like we can never be wrong because the stakes are so high on so many of these cases, as well as if it's a corporate case, you have to worry about potential liability of a great deal of liability potentially. So we have to be very cautious and make sure that the whistleblower is credible and that the concern is substantiated. Now, the law itself says the person can actually be wrong and still qualify for protection, but they have to have a reasonable belief that what they're saying is right. And reasonable is interpreted as being an average person with that level of skill and knowledge seeing something. Would they conclude with the average or the typical or the reasonable person, would they consider that to be wrongdoing or fall into those categories that I mentioned? And definitely we go further than that. We really do think we have to substantiate what they have to say.
Just to give listeners a kind of a sense of who might come to you, are there some examples that stand out to you?
We have people who are blowing the whistle right now in our organization. We're dealing with those concerns that have to do with what is happening throughout the government in terms of the DOGE kinds of decisions. We have 7 whistleblowers from the Voice of America in the first administration of Trump's presidency. We had 30 who came forward as well. And so some of the same people are now blowing the whistle, as well as there are many others at Voice of America, and which, what their concerns are is all of a sudden this agency with 1,600 journalists, they lock down the building, they deny anyone internet access to their own emails and their own communication, and they shut it all down overnight. And these people are just out in the cold. Their jobs are gone. And now the administration is actually putting forward that 30 people at Voice of America, now this is Voice of America that goes out to 425 million people weekly listening to or watching the broadcasts of Voice of America and Radio Free Asia. 425 million people all of a sudden now are listening to music or just silence, because now the administration is actually putting forward that 30 and one, I think they've also asserted maybe 80 people could do what essentially 1,600 people used to do. I mean, it's not possible. And so they're blowing the whistle on the fact that the Congress has appropriated these hundreds of millions of dollars to operate this not unbiased news through to the entire world, and it's being closed down, not by congressional action, which does have the authority to do that, but instead by an executive action and an executive order. And so we have all those people blowing the whistle on that.
Louis, we're three lawyers on this call, and so we understand process takes time and that there is a process for all of these things. It would seem to me that sometimes the non-lawyers looking at what you do, listening and reading these stories says, yeah, that sounds fine, but how long is it going to take? And if something gets fixed, how do you repair it? How do you give these people their jobs back months or years later? Talk to us a little about the process. That must be a challenge for your organization.
It's a challenge to win. The legal process is a challenge, but at the same time, the courts do have the power, issuing temporary restraining orders and preliminary injunctions to stop some of the activity that's going on right now because of the use of executive orders to essentially impound what the Congress has actually appropriated. It is a long process, but I do think justice is going to eventually prevail. It just takes time.
Jackie, I want to take a moment to reflect that as we're talking about optimism in action, many of our guests say that they first started thinking about a career in public service while they were still in law school. And schools like yours and mine, Monterey College of Law, provide an affordable, convenient way for working adults to attend law school and pursue these interests. Classes are taught by practicing lawyers and judges who prepare our students to serve their community in many of the same areas that we are discussing here on Sidebar. For more information, go to montereylaw.edu. Louis, you do some international work as well. Your organization does, and I know you have personally. I think sometimes we take for granted, sometimes at some risk, as we're seeing now, protections in the United States under our laws. Are whistleblower protections unique to the United States?
They began here almost 20 years before any other country, and that was Great Britain. Our whistleblower protections began in 1978, and then almost 16 years later, I guess, Great Britain did enact legislation. Now there are something like 64 countries that have whistleblower protection, and of those, 27 are members of the European Union. We have worked with the European Union for 5 or 6 years now, helping them to develop a directive which is essentially requiring every European nation in the Union to enact comprehensive whistleblower protections with a lot of requirements that those laws have to include. Of those, the majority are probably better now than our own laws.
Interesting. And I would think, like so many things right now, does it feel like the United States is losing credibility abroad when it comes to the enforcement of these kinds of ideals or protections?
I can just observe, like all of us or any of us could do, is that's what it looks like to me. But I will say this, who is in the lead in terms of spreading democracy in relationship to raising concerns in the workplace? It really has to be European Union.
We've talked a lot about, obviously, this government accountability project. Are there similar protections outside of the government? If I'm a corporate employee and I see something that's on that same list that you gave, illegality, gross waste, mismanagement, do I have a place to go? And do you get calls like that and have to say, I'm sorry, that's not our area of enforcement?
It is our area of expertise. In fact, I think up until 2016, we were at almost 40% of our cases were corporate and not government. We even toyed with the idea of adding corporate government and corporate accountability and decided not to do that. But the corporate cases were definitely growing in part because a number of the scandals in relationship to the banks, certainly, and certainly in relationship to corporate behavior. We just are flooded now with government cases or government employees.
There's two different things that I think we hear about in the news. In both situations, I think people would refer to themselves as whistleblowers, but I don't think the law does. And I'm just going to use Daniel Ellsberg, who is the person who released Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and then to other publications as well, that kind of brought to light the Vietnam War, potential abuse of power, and other things going on there. Obviously, that occurred before the whistleblower statutes were in place, as compared to Colonel Vindman, who also disclosed information that occurred in the context of diplomatic conversation between two presidents. Why was Daniel Ellsberg, assuming it occurred now, be subject to potential prison, whereas Colonel Vindman would be protected?
They're both whistleblowers and actually were friends. I think they met. I think they got along. That's what I understand. But the difference was Daniel Ellsberg released classified documents. I think unfortunate is that there is no sort of like public interest defense. I mean, it was definitely in the public interest for the public to know what our government was doing, especially when our government was lying about the whole nature of the war and how it was being pursued. And that's what the Pentagon Papers revealed to the American public, that actually they had been lied to. That was clearly whistleblowing. But the fact is, if it's classified, no matter what, you're subject to potential prosecution and, well, likely prosecution, regardless of the importance of the information that might be in those documents that you're releasing. And Daniel Ellsberg would have been prosecuted. He was in the middle of being prosecuted when he was essentially the case was thrown out because of misbehavior on the part of the President Nixon.
Louis, we've characterized this season of Sidebar as optimism in action. You are working in an area and on topics and on a mission that doesn't always come across as optimistic. And many times I think we're worried that things are getting worse, not better. Can you give us a glimpse of something that you would say is optimistic in this, the successes of your organization, perhaps others that are assisting, perhaps the willingness of people to come forward? How would you direct us in that manner?
For one thing is the court decisions are almost 90% in favor of openness, in favor of guardrails, in favor of challenging illegal orders on the part of this administration. And by the way, we are nonpartisan. Last week we had 2 weeks of solid news coverage about our concerns about how President Biden's administration handled East Palestine. So we're basically an equal opportunity irritant in terms of whoever might be president. In terms of the courts, they are overturning most of the executive orders so far. So I think that's reason for optimism. We've had 2,000 people who have contacted us for some levels of help or wanting to help. Obviously, way beyond our abilities to handle all those cases. But these people are ready to essentially talk to us and others about what is actually happening within the government at this time. We've never seen anything like it. And so I will say over the next few years, I think we'll be seeing more and more people who will essentially be coming forward talking about what's happening should be of concern to the American public. But I'm very optimistic. I think we have the courts there operating effectively, and I think that the American people are responding in support of what the courts are essentially doing currently. And I think that's a lot of reasons to be optimistic.
Louis, I think the other piece that stands out for me is that you have worked for GAP for 40 years, which means that you continue to believe in its mission and what it does and its success rate. And I think that's, first of all, a big thank you to you for making this your life's work. And secondly, thanks for giving us some optimism about, I'm sure in that 40 years, you've seen a lot of ups and downs in terms of government accountability, and the pendulum has swung from one end to the other. And I'm counting on it swinging in the direction of ethics and morality and accountability again. So thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for talking with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Louis, thank you very much. This is exactly the session we wanted to have, and we've learned so much. Thank you for the work you do.
Mitch, I thought it was really interesting that in addition to the physical fear that some whistleblowers feel, that he identified the retaliation, but also the futility as something that interferes with people's or worries people or concerns them about speaking out about bad acts within the government or with their employment context. And I think futility is something that we kind of brought up implicitly during the conversation with Louis. Like, how do you handle if it feels as if things aren't moving forward as quickly or aren't changing? Some people might blow a whistle and it may be years before the government responds in some realistic way with ethical guidelines or a law change or some other kind of change in how the government operates to respond to what they blew the whistle about. And so futility I hadn't really thought about in the context of whistleblowing, but that seems like it would be a real concern right now.
I agree, Jackie. I'm sure if someone's sitting there thinking, should I take the risk? Should I risk my job, my financial well-being, and in some cases physical safety to step up and be a whistleblower? And yet, what will happen? How do I know it'll be worth it? But I have to say, it sounded to me like the Government Accountability Project does a good job of counseling those individuals to help them understand what are the realistic expectations of what will happen, when it will happen. And I did like the fact that when we talked about optimism, he talked about the number of people who are willing to take that risk and take that step, really not only on their own behalf, but really thinking about what the government should be doing for all of us. They have information, they have insight, they have ethics and standards that they believe should be upheld, and they're willing to step forward and say, help us see that this gets done. And Louis and his organization do that.
Once again, I want to thank everyone who joined us today on Sidebar. And as always, Mitch and I would love to know what's on your mind. You can reach us at sidebarmedia.org.
Sidebar would not be possible without our producer, David Eakin, who composes and plays all of the music you hear on Sidebar. Thank you also to Dina Dowsett, who creates and coordinates Sidebar's social media marketing.
Colleges of Law and Monterey College of Law are part of a larger organization called California Accredited Law Schools. All of our schools are dedicated to providing access and opportunity to a legal education to marginalized communities.
For more information about the California Accredited Law Schools, go to calawschools.org. That's calawschools.org.